April 11th, 1945, the outskirts of Weimar, Germany. American soldiers of the 81st Infantry Division marched along a narrow forest road, exhausted but alert, pushing toward the city that intelligence said was still defended by remnants of the Wehrmacht. The war was in its final weeks, but the fight in central Germany hadn't died with it. Every copse of trees, every farmhouse, every ditch could still hide men willing to make a last stand. That's why the column froze when a scout up front raised his fist. Ahead, partially obscured by the tangle of pines and drifting smoke from distant shelling, a small group stepped into view. Not soldiers, not civilians. Something in between. White aprons, grey skirts, Red Cross armbands, a dozen German nurses, tense, pale, and visibly shaking. They held their hands high, fingers spread, their knuckles white around the straps of medical satchels. One of them, younger than the rest, stood forward as if she'd been pushed there. Her chin trembled. She whispered in frantic German to the woman beside her, who kept repeating, "Ruhig, ruhig." Trying to calm her, the Americans slowly raised their rifles, not because they wanted to shoot, but because in 1945, anything could be a trick. Plenty of Wehrmacht units had already used fake medics as decoys. Others had booby-trapped wounded soldiers. Surrenders didn't always mean surrender. The nurses saw the hesitation and panicked. The young one stepped forward and cried out the only English she seemed to know, "Please, don't kill us." Her voice cracked so sharply that it startled even the Americans. The platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Morgan, stepped out, palms open to show he wasn't preparing to fire. He motioned his men to lower slightly, not fully, never fully, but enough to signal they weren't about to unleash a volley. "Easy," he said gently. "We're not here to hurt you." But the nurses didn't relax. One of them kept glancing into the trees, terrified of someone behind them. Another kept squeezing a small rosary against her chest. Two were quietly crying. It took the Americans a moment to realize why. They weren't afraid because they expected execution. They were afraid because, for years, Nazi propaganda hammered the same warning into every German ear. If you are captured by Americans or British, they will mutilate the women, torture the prisoners, and kill the wounded. So these nurses, who had spent months patching up dying boys in field hospitals, genuinely believed this was the final moment of their lives. Sergeant Morgan finally said, "You're safe now, the war is almost over." But the nurses didn't believe him. Not yet. Their fear ran deeper than words. Only when he stepped forward slowly, carefully, and gently motioned toward their bags, asking permission to inspect them, did their trembling start to ease. They let him open them. Inside, bandages, medical alcohol, forceps, morphine vials, not a single weapon. The American soldiers exchanged looks. These were not combatants, just exhausted women who had spent too long near the front, battered by air raids, hunger, and the constant threat of assault from retreating German troops who viewed nurses as disposable. Morgan exhaled and signaled the column to stand down. "All right," he said softly, "you're coming with us." And for the first time since stepping into the clearing, the nurses' shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in relief. They were alive, and they were finally out of the war. The Americans escorted the German nurses down the muddy road, moving them toward a makeshift field HQ that had been set up inside a damaged farmhouse. The nurses walked in a nervous cluster, whispering nervously to each other, jumping whenever artillery rumbled in the distance. The youngest nurse, the one whose voice had cracked when she begged not to be killed, kept sneaking glances at the American soldiers. Not angry, not hateful, just confused. These weren't the monsters she'd been warned about. As they reached the farmhouse, Lieutenant Harris, the officer in charge, stepped out and scanned the group. He muttered to Morgan, "Nurses. Hell, I expected more pockets of SS. Not this." Inside, the farmhouse smelled of mud, gun oil, and burned wood. A couple of American medics were treating wounded infantrymen on cots. When the nurses were guided in, the US medics paused, and then something unexpected happened. One of the Americans nodded politely to them. Another offered a stool. He even said in broken German, "Sit, no danger, alles gut." The nurses stared at him like he'd spoken magic. Propaganda had told them American soldiers laughed while hurting prisoners. Reality was showing them kindness they hadn't seen in months. Lieutenant Harris stepped forward. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't harsh either. "We need names and units," he said. "We're not here to punish you, just making sure you're who you say you are." The senior German nurse, a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a medical cross stitched on her collar, straightened her back and said, "We served at a field hospital south of Jena. The front collapsed. Soldiers abandoned their posts. We fled." Harris nodded. Morgan added quietly, "They look like they've been through hell." As the questioning continued, something shifted. The American medics, noticing the nurses staring at the wounded soldiers, made a gesture that surprised everyone. They offered the nurses medical supplies, a roll of bandages, morphine syringes, a basin of clean water, as if to say, if you want to help, help. For a moment, the nurses hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. But then instinct, the one thing war hadn't killed, took over. They moved to the wounded American men, checked pulses, cleaned wounds, adjusted splints, whispered gentle words, the same ones they had said to dying German boys, and the American soldiers watched in silence. Not enemies, not prisoners, just humans patching up other humans. By the end of the hour, the tension in the room had thawed completely. The nurses weren't terrified anymore, they were finally breathing freely. As evening fell, the farmhouse grew quiet. The Americans heated rations over a small stove. The nurses sat together, blanketed with spare US coats, watching the steam rise from metal cups. Then came the moment that changed everything. Morgan, the same sergeant who met them on the road, handed the youngest nurse a chocolate bar. Her eyes widened. Not because she loved chocolate, but because she hadn't seen any in nearly a year. She didn't take it at first. Morgan pushed it gently toward her hand. "Go on," he said. "It's fine." She took a tiny bite, then froze, overwhelmed. Then she broke off pieces and handed them to the others. It was the first time in hours that any of them had smiled. The conversation opened like a door that had been locked for too long. One nurse described how their field hospital had been bombed 3 times. Another talked about treating boys as young as 16 who had been thrown into the fight as Volkssturm. The senior nurse revealed she hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night for weeks. Then the Americans shared their own stories. How they'd lost friends in the Ardennes, how they'd marched through towns leveled to ashes, how they understood fear just as deeply as the nurses did. Different uniforms, same human exhaustion. At one point, the youngest nurse admitted softly, "We thought you would kill us." Morgan shook his head. "No, never. We don't kill medics. We were told Americans." She hesitated, searching for the right English. "Hurt women." The room went quiet. Lieutenant Harris clenched his jaw. "Who told you that?" "Posters, radio, officers, everyone." Morgan finally replied, "Well, they lied." The nurse looked down, blinking hard. "I see that now." Silence fell again, not tense, but reflective. War fed them lies. Reality fed them truth. And the truth was healing them faster than any bandage. The next morning, orders arrived. The nurses were to be processed as non-combatant POWs and transported to a rear area for safety. It wasn't punishment, just procedure. When the Americans told them, the nurses didn't panic this time. They simply gathered their belongings, mostly medical tools and a few personal items, and prepared for the truck ride. As they stepped outside, they paused. The American medics they had helped were sitting up now, wrapped in blankets. One lifted a hand weakly and said, "Danke." The nurses smiled. Another soldier handed them a small crate of supplies, water, crackers, blankets for the trip. It wasn't necessary, but it was humane. Sergeant Morgan approached the youngest nurse, the one whose terrified cry had echoed through the trees the day before. He extended his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, then shook it. "Are you afraid now?" Morgan asked. She thought, then shook her head. "No, not anymore." The truck rumbled to life. The nurses climbed aboard. As it drove off, the Americans watched them disappear down the ruined road, white aprons fluttering in the wind. Not enemies, not threats, not propaganda's monsters. Just people caught in a war that twisted everything, until the moment kindness untwisted it again. And for the rest of their lives, both sides would remember that strange, quiet day at the end of a brutal war. When fear dissolved, humanity resurfaced, and the truth finally broke through the lies.